Hi, thank you for joining us for this webinar on heat stress and its impact on seafood workers. I'm Amy McGann, Director of Social Responsibility at Global Seafood Alliance. GSA works to advance responsible seafood. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. All participants are automatically on mute. You'll get a recording of the presentation after the webinar. We'll have a live Q&A at the end, so please type your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. So extreme heat, and as you'll hear, other extreme weather events such as increased storminess are becoming a serious threat to worker safety. And so we're hosting this webinar to provide information on how heat stress impacts workers, particularly wild capture fishers and aquaculture workers. During the webinar, Halshka, who works for the International Labor Organization, will provide an overview on research she's conducted on heat stress and how it impacts workers in all sectors. And then Jess Sparks, assistant professor at Tufts, will provide information on research she's conducted on heat stress and increased storminess and its impact on wild capture fishers, and provide some recommendations on what companies can do to help prevent the negative impacts of heat stress on workers. And finally, we'll hear from Kirill, who works at the IUF, a global union federation representing a range of workers, including aquaculture and seafood processing plant workers. And he'll share information on how heat stress is impacting aquaculture workers and what workers would like to see done to help prevent the negative impacts. So with that, over to you, Halshka.
Be here with all of you. I'm Halshka Graysick. I'm a technical specialist on occupational safety and health, and I'll be giving an overview today about heat at work, as well as different climate hazards, what this means for the safety and health of workers worldwide, specifically in this industry. I'm already to say that this is a huge topic of work. It's a huge topic of research, of policy analysis, and we have a limited time today. But it's truly a vast area of current priorities for many organizations, including the International Labor Organization. And a quick word on the ILO. The ILO is a specialized United Nations agency. It was created in 1919 with the mandate of promoting social justice for all, including through the assurance of safe and healthy working conditions. We represent 187 governments around the world, as well as workers' organizations and employers' organizations. So one of the areas that we've been increasingly working on is this concept of climate hazards and worker exposures. And today we'll be mostly focusing on heat stress, on rising temperatures, but it's important from the very beginning to emphasize that workers do not work in a bubble. They are very rarely exposed to only one hazard. And when we think about the changing of the current climate, we have to be very aware that rising temperatures, extreme temperatures are just one part of the equation. We're also very much concerned with workers' exposures to UV radiation, to outdoor air pollution, to the potential increase of vector-borne diseases, as well as changes in the uses of different chemicals. Now, we also are very much concerned with extreme weather events. So Amy already mentioned increased storminess. So we see floods, droughts, cyclones, tornadoes, changes in the normal pattern of weather events and how they also impact worker safety and health and the general safety of the workplace, not only from a temperature position, but also from a natural disaster perspective. So to give you already some numbers and to show the scale of this problem worldwide, the work of the ILO is to conduct global research, to work with our national statistical offices to collect data on mortality, morbidity, and exposure to different workplace hazards. And here you already see the vast impact of some of these exposures. Our most recent studies have shown that every year, 2.4 billion workers, almost 70% of the global working population, are exposed to excessive heat, leading to around 22 million occupational injuries worldwide, just from excessive heat alone. Now, we know that this is clearly just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of issues with reporting between informal, formal working environments, as well as the ability to code different types of injuries and different types of exposures. So we know that we're likely highly underestimated here, but at least we start to see the beginning of the situation. So added to the excessive heat exposures, we also see the figures for solar UV radiations, the amount of vector-borne diseases for working populations, as well as impacts due to air pollution, agrochemicals, and extreme weather events. And these impacts can range from things like heat stress, heat stroke, to fatalities from injuries, to these various diseases, as well as chronic outcomes such as cancers and many others that workers unfortunately are facing around the world. When we think about the workers that are most at risk, we'll be talking today about aquaculture workers, but within that sector, we have to realize that there is a lot of intrapersonal variability when it comes to the specific status of the worker. We know that outdoor workers, like many of those working in fisheries and aquaculture, will be exposed to the most intense temperature conditions, working outside under the sun. But we also have to remember that there's a lot of other indicators for these workers. They're not just working outside and being exposed to the elements. They're also working in physically demanding occupations. They have very high metabolic heat because of the physical activity that they're undertaking. They may also be wearing different types of personal protective equipment that might be thermally insulated, that might not give them the ability also to cool down the body when the temperature is rising. We have to think about other vulnerabilities that also might be present in the sector, whether we're talking about migrant workers that may not understand the safety precautions and instructions during training, informal workers that are working without formalized OSH infrastructure, women and pregnant workers that face intense vulnerabilities when it comes to these exposures, as well as potentially older workers or workers with disabilities. So we have to take all of these considerations into account when we're conducting a risk assessment to understand what workers might be exposed to and how they might be impacted by these different conditions. Now, I just wanted to take some time to get a bit deeper into the data so that you can understand the regional breakdown and what we're finding in terms of workers' exposures to heat stress. So I already showed the data on the left that shows the 2.4 billion workers that are exposed. But here you see in the different colors of the different regions, you see how each region is being exposed differently and how these exposures are changing. So we see in the middle here, the regions with the highest workforce exposure to excessive heat in green. These are regions that are traditionally exposed to hot temperatures. This is something that we were not surprised to see. The African region, Arab states, and Asia, the Pacific, where you have a very high percentage of the workforce that is exposed to excessive heat. We also see regions with the highest proportion of occupational injuries attributable to excessive heat. These are in the African region and in the Americas region. And now on the right-hand side of the screen, these are really important because this shows the regions that have, one, the most rapidly increasing workforce exposure to excessive heat since 2000. So this shows the uptick in exposures, and we see that happening in Europe and in Central Asia. And it's no surprise, I think, to many of us, the ones that are in the European region this week who are experiencing this intense heat wave. And we also see below the regions with the most rapidly increasing heat-related occupational injuries. This is also happening in Europe and Central Asia, but also in the Americas. And this is showing us a rapid increase in the number of heat-related occupational injuries since 2000. So this is all to say that no region is spared. All regions are being affected by occupational heat stress, but regions are facing this challenge differently. And this is where we really have to make precise policy recommendations and policy solutions to match the realities of the regions that we're working in. So a few more stats to give you. I'm going to focus on the stats in yellow here because I think they're the most telling and the most crucial to share. In our research, we found that a majority of worker exposures to excessive heat and the majority of occupational injuries, both fatal and not fatal, are happening outside of an official heat wave. So this means that a majority of worker exposures to occupational heat stress are happening before the trigger of an official heat wave. So for example, here in the European region where we're facing an official heat wave in this moment, many workers are already being exposed and falling ill and are being injured before the triggering of this. And what does this mean? This shows us that workers are more vulnerable to the impacts of heat. They're suffering from the impacts before, because they are exposed, of course, in a very different way than the general public. We have specific indicators for heat wave actions for the general public when a heat wave is triggered, but these are very different when it comes to worker exposures. Workers are exposed all day long with limited ability sometimes to leave the workplace or the desire to continue working to maintain their wages, or because of their intense metabolic heat, because of the physical activity they're undertaking, or the thermal insulation from their personal protective equipment. So this is critical for policymaking because we know that we need to be triggering preventative and protective measures for workers even before we have an official heat wave in that specific area. So this is a key takeaway message today from this presentation. Now, looking at some of the things that the ILO has done to respond and how we can react to this challenge. The International Labor Organization is responsible for creating international labor standards, and we know that we have a very strong foundation globally that already exists when it comes to ensuring that workers have the right to a safe and healthy working environment. So in 2022, the International Labor Conference, so this meeting of 187 member states, workers, and employers all came together to agree that workers around the world, in all countries, in all sectors, including in the aquaculture and fisheries sector, have the rights, the fundamental principle and rights to a safe and healthy working environment. So this gives us a foundation for action to say that there are no excuses. We need to implement preventative and protective measures for workers. And we have all of these conventions and recommendations that already exist and that provide the blueprints of how to ensure safe and healthy work for workers, regardless of the sector they're working in. Now, in addition to international labor standards, what are some of the actions that we've seen governments take, and what are some of the actions that can then trickle down to the workplace level and to the employer responsibility level? We know that it's critical to conduct participatory risk assessments in the workplace to understand what are the hazards when it comes to heat stress, what are the tasks that might put the workers at most risk, and who is the most vulnerable. This leads us into the second point, identification of targeted strategies for at-risk worker groups. So these are the workers that are working outdoors, under the sun, workers that might be in the informal economy, or populations that might be at increased vulnerability, whether that's migrant workers or female workers, etc. We go to the third point, the importance of setting maximum temperature limits to understand at what point there needs to be either a stoppage of work or there needs to be preventative or protective measures implemented. These are things that now follow. For example, if we meet a certain temperature indicator, should there be hydration strategies that are implemented, including, of course, adequate sanitation facilities when we're thinking about female workers? If we're implementing hydration strategies and providing the responsibility for workers to hydrate, we also have to provide the responsibility of ensuring adequate sanitary conditions so that especially female workers working in rural areas are not discouraged from properly hydrating. The next issue is about in ensuring rest and work breaks or modified work schedules to limit or avoid exposure to to excessive heat, and usually to the hottest part of the day. These are things like moving working hours to more cooler moments of the day, or ensuring that there's adequate rest breaks in cool and shaded rest areas. So a common measure we use is 10 minutes for every 50 minutes worked, 10 minutes of a rest break in a cool and shaded rest area. The next important point is heat acclimatization measures for workers that have not had recent heat exposure. This is often overlooked, but we know that a majority of the injuries related to heat stress for workers are happening on the very first or the second day of work in a hot environment. So we know that workers need to have an adequate acclimatization schedule for their own physiology to get used to the specific working conditions. And this is critical, especially for migrant workers that may be working in new areas. The next point is the importance of personal protective equipment that is specifically designed to protect workers from heat stress while not further putting them at risk for increased temperatures. So breathable personal protective equipment, things that will provide shade, things that will be appropriate to work in hot environments, but at the same time that are protective for the hazards they may face. The last two measures are critical. We can't be in workplaces without them. Things like education and awareness on heat stress and heat-related injuries, training on how workers can protect themselves. We do know that the cascade going from heat stress to heat stroke can be an incredibly quick movement, and that often workers are simply not aware of the risk that they might face. If they're feeling faint, if they're feeling tired, if they're feeling lightheaded, they may continue to work just to push through and get to the end of the day. But we know that very quickly, without much knowledge to the worker themselves, that heat stress can quickly devolve into something much more serious. And finally, the importance of regular medical checkups and health monitoring, ensuring that workers are fit to work, that they don't have any other chronic or existing diseases or situations that might put them at increased risk from heat-related injuries. Here, it's a complex slide with a lot of numbers, and I put it here on purpose to highlight the difficulties that we have these days in implementing some of this policy advice into practical workplace measures. Here you see different countries and their examples of their own heat stress indicators, whether that's a wet bulb indicator or just an air temperature indicator or a heat index indicator, but the different types of figures that they use. Some countries have temperature limits for extreme high metabolic work, for lower, more sedentary work, but you see that the range is very different, and it truly depends on the country that the worker is in. Now, it's one thing for countries to set these limits. It's a whole nother question of how employers can enforce these limits in the workplace. And this is where the discussions with social dialogue is so critical between governments, employers, organizations, and trade unions is so critical to make sure that this policy advice is implemented in a practical and usable manner at the workplace level to truly protect workers. And on this note, I'd like to call your attention to the first ever tripartite validated guidance that has been established for protecting workers from extreme weather events and changing weather patterns. This happened recently, about 2 months ago in Geneva at the International Labor Organization, where for the first time, governments, employers, and workers came together to word for word agree on what are the basic building blocks for the national legislative level and for the workplace level to ensure that workers are protected. And so I've included the link here. Well, not yet. First, we'll get to some of the basic principles that we discussed in the meeting. What's most important to understand here from this meeting is that there was a general agreement that we're not only talking about heat stress, we're talking about a combination of changing weather patterns, of extreme weather events, that might impact workers, especially in the aquaculture sector and especially in the fisheries sector. And these exposures can lead to synergistic risks for workers, and especially those workers that are working in the informal economy and that are in situations of vulnerability. So this was a paradigm shift for the world of work, because this is the first agreement where, in a tripartite way, we see that there is an understanding that this is a priority for the world of work. Workers need to be protected, and they need to be protected from the multifaceted climate hazards and not only heat stress. So I've included the link in the presentation here, where you can read the clear guidance that's provided for employers at the workplace level on how to protect workers from heat stress. And this certainly applies to the aquaculture and fisheries sector. And these are things that are well accepted by scientific evidence, things like setting maximum temperature limits, enforcing them, having health surveillance and monitoring for workers to ensure that they are still coming to work and leaving work healthy and safe, and ensuring that there is a constant communication between workers and employers on things like risk assessment and the implementation of preventative and protective measures. So I think here I'll pass it back to you, Amy, to go to the next speaker, since we have such limited time, but I'm very happy to answer any questions on this topic. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jess Sparks. As Amy mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Tufts University in the US. And today I'll be speaking quite briefly on some work that we've been doing more broadly on climate risk for fishers, and with a special sort of emphasis or particular emphasis on migrant fishers. So I think it's always important to point out that fishing has some unique sector risk in that we're talking about workers on a mobile workplace. So the climate hazards and risks that they face can change throughout the duration of their employment based on where their vessel is. Also different regulatory regimes, etc. What's also unique about fishing is they are, of course, chasing a wild resource. So when we speak to fishermen in the sector, we hear examples of how climate change and extreme heat and storminess in particular are directly affecting them, but also the indirect effects that they experience due to the direct effects on the fish and then indirectly affecting them. Under most laws, captains have sole decision-making authority at sea and are responsible for the vessel, which means that sometimes workers don't actually have the agency or feel like they don't have the agency to take preventative actions to prevent severe consequences from these climate risks. And we're going to talk a little bit today. We've started this project focusing broadly on climate risk, but something that's been emerging recently is that few legal frameworks adequately protect the fundamental labor right to refuse hazardous work in fishing. And in particular, migrant fishers seem to be more vulnerable to these climate risks, since actually immigration restrictions significantly limit their ability to refuse hazardous work. As I always say, a fishing port is a border. It's a geopolitical border often. And in countries, we often talk about distant water fishing. I'm going to highlight countries like the US and the UK, where their vessels are fishing closer to shore, or, not going out to sea for as long as distant water vessels. But in these countries, these workers work on these vessels. They can legally work on the vessels without work visas, which means that they are typically required to live on board those vessels. And as a result, if the vessel is going to sea and there's extreme weather, extreme heat, etc., and they know it's coming, they cannot refuse to go to sea without being in violation of immigration restrictions. So, for example, in the UK, where fishing trips, tend to be 5 to 7 days, you actually have the ability or have some information to know what risk you might face in terms of weather events. However, if the migrant fisherman is on a transit visa and they would say, we hear everyone talking about this extreme weather coming, we don't want to go to sea, they have to make a choice between an immigration violation and their safety by going out to sea. So the work that we've been doing, it actually started from findings from a survey where we have surveys from about 4,100 fishermen worldwide. So they represent about a little over 100 nationalities working on vessels flagged to over 90 flag states. And they're going to 400 ports or had contact with 400 ports all over the world. And we didn't actually include any questions about climate risk in the survey. The survey was more broadly about their working conditions. The fishers were spontaneously describing risk and hazards, their inability or their frustration to prevent injuries, et cetera, related to these risks. So we really learned firsthand from the fishers themselves. And then we went to the literature, we're researchers, we went to the literature to see what was being discussed there. And then we ended up facilitating a workshop with fishers, unions, union reps, and also government agencies, occupational safety and health agencies, to map out what are these risks that they are experiencing. So this is probably a little hard to see. I apologize. It's got a lot of information in it. But basically, fishers talked about, we can talk about sort of 5 main climate hazards that they felt like they were experiencing. Storminess, temperature, and environmental toxins were the ones that they were directly experiencing. So those extreme weather events. Temperature was not just extreme heat, but several fishers, particularly those fishing on the North Sea or down near Antarctica, also talked about extreme cold and being unprepared, not having suitable PPE for that extreme cold as well. And increasingly, we've heard a lot of fishers talk about exposure to environmental toxins. They may not always use that word, but they talk about growths that they see in water and having severe skin conditions as a result of having contact with contaminated water, and again having inadequate PPE. And so these things cause injuries. They also cause, we talk a lot about the physical health impacts. Mental health impacts were also very prominent in these fishers' experiences. And then indirectly, we know about ocean deoxygenation, ocean acidification, and ecosystem productivity, which is changing fish stock abundance and location, leading to longer fishing trips. And some of the impacts that they talked about from that, extreme fatigue, longer fishing hours. A lot of fishers talked about as fish stocks are changing and their work hours are getting longer, they're often denied breaks to urinate. And so organ dysfunction from restrictions on urinating and defecating has also been discussed quite often amongst the fishers that we have engaged with. Also, longer trips, malnutrition from a lack of fresh food, diseases from unhygienic conditions on board, or even, we talked about extreme heat earlier, poor ventilation on vessels, etc. And again, I want to highlight beyond the physical effects, a lot of fishers talk about the mental health effects as well, and something that I think definitely deserves more attention and isn't always as frequently discussed. In this work, we've identified some areas also where we really need more information and perhaps more data, and that is specifically around are there vessel like gear type or fishery risk that predict the likelihood of being exposed, or more likely or less likely to be exposed to these climate hazards. And also any type of, worker vulnerabilities or occupational risk that influence susceptibility to adverse health outcomes when exposed. Something that also came up a lot is trying to understand the onset of when more slow onset health effects are actually attributed to these climate hazards and how that relates to workman compensation insurance. So for example, up in the UK, we heard fishers, including UK nationals who fish, talk about increasing rough seas and the pitch of the vessel causing chronic back injuries. Although it's very difficult for the fishers to, provide quote unquote evidence that that's what's causing the chronic back injuries, but severely debilitating injuries that may impact their ability to obtain work in fishing in the future. And so, also really understanding the onset from when you have a hazard, sort of the time elapsed from when you have an exposure to when you may have onset of physical or mental health effects from these risks, and the implications of that. Oh, I went too far. And some recommendations from workers that have come out of this work is having clear guidelines for when no go to sea or no fish days. So of course, with distant water fishing, they're out there for several months at a time. And so it's a bit of a different dynamic. You wouldn't not go to sea because you're already out at sea. But a lot of fishers talk about how if they refuse to go on deck to work, in particular, because of extreme heat, because of storminess, it means that their pay is typically deducted. So they feel like they're unable to exercise the right to refuse hazardous work again. And then, of course, we have the issues with immigration, in particular with no-go to sea days. Due to some of the issues with the time to onset of these health symptoms, health outcomes, contract terms for medical care, and again, contract terms to support the refusal of hazardous work. More accurate information about the work and the work environment. So is this a work environment where they're going to potentially be exposed to extreme heat, extreme cold, etc.? Enforceable standards for food and water on board the vessel. So we know in ILO C-188, there is a provision that employers are required to provide sufficient quality and quantity of nutritious food and water on board. In some countries that have ratified the convention, that is not well operationalized and therefore really difficult to enforce. And we know that food and water is very important to the fishers, and that the fishers feel like this is actually a really important preventative step. So I can give an example. A couple of years ago, I was in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and we were boarding fishing boats and talking to the crew. And there had recently been an extreme heat wave. And the real difference in terms of how fishers felt like their work was during that event was the availability of extra bottled water and the availability of fans. So there was one vessel in particular where the crew felt like it was really no big deal. And they felt like it was no big deal because the employer had made sure to provide extra bottled water. So they felt like they had sufficient water, they could take breaks to drink the water, they were provided additional fans, etc., for their sleeping quarters. And so that they felt like that made a big difference. Training, they wanted more training specific to, how do you work on board in extreme weather, particularly rough seas, etc. If there's going to be more night work because of extreme heat and UV exposure, then, training for how to work more safely at night in particular. As I mentioned, the issue with the time to onset, so insurance coverage. And also related would be improved dispute resolution processes. So these are recommendations from the fishers themselves, and how this, I think, translates into actions that companies can take is that companies, first and foremost, can strengthen their human rights due diligence processes by systematically assessing how climate change affects working conditions and continuously assessing for that. The workers are the ones experiencing that, so they're going to be the first ones who know, what new issues are popping up. Also related to that would be engaging fishers in identifying the risk and the solutions, and making sure that as companies, you are acting on those recommendations. And if there has been a harm, making sure to provide remedy. I think, one of the fundamental parts of human rights due diligence is that it requires companies to have that continuous and ongoing engagement with the workers and their representatives themselves. And that's going to be really important to monitor for unintended consequences. Like we talked about, fishing at night is also very dangerous for different reasons. And so any type of actions or preventive measures, are there any unintended consequences in particular? But also, companies are increasingly implementing policies like employer pays, and how those policies are enforced are very similar to how companies can take actions. First and foremost would be to work with unions. Unions have very good climate measures in their collective bargaining agreements. And, some union contracts, I've looked at CBAs from South America in particular, there are policies for stopping work due to extreme weather on fishing boats, guaranteeing access to telemedicine, medical evacuation procedures, employer coverage and medical cost, etc. And also, procedures for reporting safety concerns that are free from retaliation, and making sure that those are enforced. Because we all know that retaliation is one of the main barriers to fishers reporting any of the concerns that they have. And I think also that training is super important because, fishing is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world already. And there's a lot of normalization of risk. And so making sure that fishers, captains, employers, everyone understands, what is a hazardous risk and what should be acted upon, I think is very important. So I will stop there and pass it over to our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kirill Buketov, and I'm an organizer. I'm working with different categories of the workers employed in food sector for all my life. And currently, I'm based in the headquarters of the IUF, which is the international global trade union for food workers. And I'm coordinating the work of the Seafood Workers Division, which is a relatively new establishment within the IUF structure. I would like to, first of all, thank Jess and Halshka for presenting quite a deep and broad picture of the issues related to climate change and how they affect the situation of the workers, because that will simplify, first of all, my work. But I would like also to thank them for their focus on the need to consult and involve and engage with workers on any issues related to these working conditions and the need to change them or to protect them. That is where we are all united, and it's good to see for me as a union representative that academia and high-level UN expertise actually pointing at in the same direction. I will be not reading the slides because quite a lot of that was already said. But I would like to focus on the process, on a quite a significant change which the sector is undergoing at the moment. So we're talking about extreme heat and climate change as a relatively new issue. Just some years ago, when we were talking about the weather and the temperature, we normally were meaning what is the weather tomorrow? Is there a rain? Is there a hot weather? Or how do we dress? It was basically as a matter of the forecast for tomorrow, just to be ready individually for these things. Now we're discussing the change of the weather as a matter of emergency for so many people who are affected by this, because this change in weather is killing. And it's killing, first of all, the people who are not able to hide from this heat and from this impact of the weather, because simply they're supposed to do their work. And we're talking here about the people and the workers who were during the COVID pandemic called essential, those who cannot simply stop working, because the nutrition of the population of this planet depends on the contribution of each and every of them on a daily basis. So we are now talking about the need to create a system of protection for these workers, because it's not only about their health and their well-being, but it's also about the sustainability of the global food system. And here we, as workers, have created a number of proposals which were recently taken into account in different discussions at the global level. And we are now in quite interesting moment, because when we started to raise the demands, requesting that there should be a system of standards which protects workers in seafood, we were naturally at the ground level. There was no regulation at the international level, not from FAO, not from ILO, not from any other UN agency, no standard, no tool to apply to the situation of the workers in seafood. And it is changing. Within the past 10 years, there was a number of new tools developed. And recently, and that was, Halshka was talking about the outcomes of the tripartite meeting in ILO related to the climate change, and their conclusions, which are of very general nature, but they're based on and grounded on a very, very serious and in-depth report and research, which was done by, as a collective effort. For the first time, probably, this group of experts looked so much in details on the problem and decided to come up with the conclusions. These conclusions were adopted in the end of April. Naturally, 2 weeks after that, in the same room within the ILO, within the International Labour Organization, a tripartite meeting was held to create a new tool, looking specifically, going from the general conclusions and recommendations, looking at specifically situation of the workers in aquaculture, and developing the code of practice on occupational health and safety in aquaculture. So these two documents, or two pieces of work, they go hand in hand, and they are very, very fresh new. That is why this event is very timely, because now the question will be, okay, what do we do with this tool? How do we make them working, applicable, useful? How can we make sure that they not remain on the shelves of the people who develop that in their cabinets and their offices, but if they become, how they become the real instruments for change and increasing protection of the workers? That is a crucial point from our point of view. And we come to this with a very broad list of ideas and demands, because we listen to our members, these members, the workers, they're employed in fish processing and in aquaculture and fish farming all around the world. And they align with other workers in the food industry, highlighting that besides the general responsibility of the governments and intergovernmental structures, and hopefully the support from the UN system, there is a big bunch of work which is required to be done by the employers and by the companies, because nothing can change in this sector without support from the corporate world. We wanted to highlight a number of things, and we were talking about how differently these changes affect in different categories of workers. I would like to highlight that in our discussions, we have a very, very strong push from our female membership, from the women workers, who highlight how differently women suffer in specific periods of their life, mentioned in menopause, from the heat stress. This is a very different level of suffering, and this is something which we need to take into account when we develop any policy or any set of recommendations, that there should be always a serious gender focus on all the discussions. And first of all, women workers must be part of it, of these discussions. Then we go to this very specific event, which I already mentioned. So 2 weeks after the general discussion on climate change took place, a tripartite meeting, which means representatives of the workers, trade unions, the governments, those who are mostly representing the fishing nations and the main producers of or users of aquaculture production, and the companies, the employers, came together to talk about what can be done to create a tool, a code of practice on health and safety in aquaculture. And that is a quite comprehensive document with 750 different points, paragraphs. We will go in paragraph by paragraph, negotiating each of them, and very often even every word in these paragraphs. So it's a tripartite document agreed at the international level, involving the corporate and civil society, trade union expertise, and the government expertise and academia, looking at health and safety issues. Out of the 750 points, 43 are related to weather and environment. And it's a tripartite negotiated framework at the international level, which is specifically targeting thermal stress, chemical use, biological hazards, and the psychological strains caused by climate volatility. That is a list of very practical recommendations, which needs to be applied ideally in every workplace which involves production of seafood. That is not the only document. There are other documentation being developed in the same time, and one of the other serious areas for us to look at was the situation of children working and unfortunately still employed in the sector. So there is another document which was also adopted a few months ago by the FAO and ILO, a policy on elimination of child labor. We believe that children in fisheries and aquaculture, we believe that children should not be forced by economic reasons to work in this sector, and they deserve to have childhood and education. What is of crucial importance for us on whatever area of recommendations we look at, and we have our demands for inclusive policy development, economic safety nets, respect for workers' rights. These things go hand in hand from our point of view. So we demand permanent seat at the table during the development of national and local climate adaptation strategies. We demand fair taxation to fund specialized healthcare, insurance, compensation, and mandatory retraining programs for coastal communities whose localized aquaculture operations fail due to ocean acidification or warming waters. We demand more protection for migrant workers and the special look at the nature of the employment in the sector, which is still affected by many subcontracting practices and piece rate system. If you are working on piece rate, you cannot easily withdraw from the work because you can save your health and probably life by leaving the workplace, but you will have nothing to eat because you don't earn anything. So we demand the abolition of this piece rate system and creation of permanent employment across the whole sector. And of course, we want special regulation which shall help migrant workers. Why migrant workers are being mentioned so many times? Because we all know that for seafood, the migrant workforce represents almost 95% of all workers in the sector. That is the majority of the workers, and they're vulnerable. And they're vulnerable because in so many nations still, the governments refuse to recognize that these workers have the rights similar to other workers. And first of all, the governments refuse to recognize that these workers have the right to unionize and to bargain collectively for their rights. So those positive best practices which were presented by Jess earlier are not simply are not applicable to the migrant workers, because in most cases they will not have the access to the union. And this is what we want to highlight as a specific feature of this sector. This work has started maybe 10 years ago. It is now the turning point. The next period of time is extremely important, and we must recognize a very huge gap in terms of recognition of the human rights and the workers' rights. The sector have a terrible record on human rights. We have still, by statistics, more than 100,000 workers missing from the fishing vessels every year. And this is because of the very low unionization rate, where workers don't feel protected, they cannot raise their demand, they cannot come up with their proposals. And the responsibility for creation an environment in which workers will be able to do it lays on the companies. We believe it's really time now to start seriously talking about moving from the a lot of certification efforts of different voluntary codes of practices applied by different companies, by declarations, to real work on establishing a system of industrial relations in this sector, which is based on human rights and the respect of freedom of association. Thank you.
Thank you. And now if everyone wants to come off mute and turn on your cameras, Halska, Jess, and Carol, we'll have brief time for Q&A. For the audience, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat. And we have one question already. I have a couple questions, but yeah, if anyone from the audience has questions, please add them to the chat. We'll start with the first question that we received, and I will see if I can display that. So this question: are the regulations the same for Europe, the US, and the rest of the world? I assume particularly as it relates to heat stress. Does anyone want to take that one? Yeah, Carol.
Well, I will present our opinion, and that is based on our experience with international standards of human rights. The right of people to live and work in safety is a universal human right. It is part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration is universal. It applies to every human being on the planet. And it is the responsibility of the government to make sure that these rights are then spelled out in the national legislation. Of course, there are variations of the national legislations, but if we're talking about international standards, they are clear and they're very direct. These rights are universal and fundamental.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Or I think we have a second question that's coming up.
Hi, Amy, I can just add to that. Kirill had a very clear message, and it's exactly what I would say too about the global responsibilities and how regulations look like from an international human rights perspective. However, when it comes then to the individual regulations, then we look at the more national level legislation, and they are different. So every country will be responsible then for setting their own legislative framework when it comes to protecting workers from occupational heat stress, whether that comes down to different types of ways to do risk assessment or set occupational exposure limits or ensure the right to remove. But then these are all grounded in those internationally binding foundations for workers' rights and the principles to a safe and healthy working environment, as was mentioned. So there is a foundation that's laid, and then countries have the obligation to apply them in their own national context through their legislation.
Thank you. And as we're waiting for others to ask questions, I have a question that came up based on your presentation. So Carol and Jess, you both mentioned the right to refuse work. And I wonder, like, particularly for share fishers or for piece rate workers, as you mentioned, Carol, if they choose not to work, then they're not going to get paid. Have you seen any good models where workers are getting paid if they refuse to work because of extreme heat and threats to their health and safety?
I think in capture fisheries, we actually have some models from the COVID pandemic where share fishers, I believe it was in Norway, which is one of the few highly unionized capture fishery fleets. They shifted to a model where they had like a bit of a guaranteed fixed income. And so when the boats couldn't go out because there was nowhere to take the fish or there's restrictions accessing ports, it provided essentially a safety net. And so, I think there are few and far between, but there are examples of guaranteed compensation or accessing, insurance mechanisms to have compensation when you cannot work. But I think fundamentally, we know that in capture fishery, the opposite usually happens. And not only do they not get paid, there can be deductions for refusing to work, et cetera.
That is very, very the direct link between freedom of association and all other rights are coming in the picture. Because if you are not a member of the union, you can hardly think about doing it without fear of retaliation. Because most probably you will not be able to protect and defend yourself and your rights alone, individually. The union makes it different. Every workplace which is unionized has a different atmosphere and different environment. It's actually enabling all the workers to have access to all their other rights.
Yeah. Oh, I think we might. Okay, that's a comment. Thank you. And I think we only have 1 minute left, so I think I won't ask another question. And I think that's a good place to end. As you all sort of have highlighted, the extreme heat is a huge risk to worker health and safety, but it's not labor rights are all interconnected, and as you highlighted, Carol, freedom of association and collective bargaining is the enabling right, which allows workers to come together and collectively engage with their employer to come up with ways to prevent, in this case, extreme heat from causing negative repercussions that actually works for their individual workplace. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Jess, Halshka, and Carol for providing us with your expertise. And this was very informative. Thank you so much. Bye now.